They fired me for doing exactly what they'd paid me to do for 15 years. Not for missing a deadline, not for losing a client. It's because I followed the correct procedure. Sounds ridiculous. Right, I thought so too, but that's exactly what happened. Before I tell you what came next, I'm curious. Where are you listening from today? And what's the temperature like where you are? If stories like this mean something to you, consider subscribing. Every click helps these lessons travel a little farther. And sometimes the right story reaches someone who truly needs it. The story begins with a seemingly ordinary contract placed on a conference table, $32 million. A shiny new vendor partnership the sales team was celebrating like it was already printed on the quarterly report. But buried in paragraph 9 was a clause that quietly violated a standing NDA with one of our biggest financial partners. If that clause went live, it wouldn't just be awkward. It could trigger a disclosure issue with the SEC. Apparently, that was inconvenient, and I prevented that from happening. So Cole Fenwick, our brand new COO with a business school smile and a dangerous relationship with the word speed, called a meeting in the glass conference room and made his point in front of half the leadership team. People like you slow innovation. Then he fired me. I didn't argue. After 15 years as Orion's compliance manager, you learn something simple. The loudest people in the room are rarely the ones who understand the contracts. What you've heard so far is emotionally true. The rest of this story blends a few fictional elements and AI-assisted storytelling to bring the deeper lessons and hidden feelings into clearer focus. My hope is that something in it resonates with you. That evening, the silence in my apartment felt heavier than the conference room I had just left. I placed my laptop on the kitchen table, poured a cup of coffee I didn't really want, and began replaying 15 years of work at Orion Dynamics. I hadn't built products or pitched investors. My job had been quieter than that. I built the systems that kept the company out of court 15 years earlier. Orion hired me to design the internal contract control framework. At the time, most people thought compliance was just paperwork. To me, it was architecture. Every clause was a guardrail. Every revision prevented a potential disaster. Over the years, I stopped risky agreements, rewrote hundreds of vendor clauses, and quietly steered deals away from lawsuits no one else even noticed. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept the company standing. Things changed when Cole Fenwick arrived a year ago. Cole believed speed was the only metric that mattered. Legal review slowed deals. Compliance raised inconvenient questions. Within months, he created fast-track approval channels that bypassed my department entirely. Contracts began moving through the system faster than anyone could read them. I flagged the risks the way I always had. I sent careful memos. I documented the problems. The responses never came. That was when I realized something unsettling. Cole wasn't just ignoring the system, he was dismantling it piece by piece. Later that night, I opened my employment agreement out of habit more than strategy. I had helped revise the document years earlier when our former general counsel wanted stronger compliance protections. Halfway down the page, I found the line again. Clause 14C. It stated that if an employee was terminated after raising a documented compliance concern, the company would assume full legal liability and cover all litigation costs. I leaned back slowly. Cole thought he had removed an obstacle. In reality, he had just activated the most expensive clause in the building. The next morning, the shock had settled into something colder and clearer. I wasn't angry anymore. I was thinking. That was when I called Dana Whitaker. Dana specialized in corporate retaliation cases and had a reputation for dismantling bad executive decisions with surgical precision. If there was anyone who could tell me whether my situation was survivable or catastrophic, it was her. Her office was quiet, efficient, and almost aggressively calm. I placed a thin stack of documents on the table between us, the warning emails I had sent about the vendor contract, the contract itself with my annotations, and the transcript from the meeting where Cole Fenwick terminated me. Dana read without speaking. The only sound in the room was the soft turn of paper. When she reached the last page, she slid my employment agreement closer and scanned the highlighted section I had marked the night before. Clause 14C. She read it twice. Then she leaned back in her chair and studied me for a long moment, before finally speaking. "You didn't lose your job today," she said quietly. I frowned. It felt pretty official. Dana tapped the paragraph with her pen. "No," she said. "What you triggered was corporate liability." She explained it carefully, the way lawyers explain things when they want every word to land. Clause 14C meant that if an employee was terminated after raising a documented compliance concern, the company assumed full legal responsibility for any resulting litigation, not partially, completely. They would have to cover all legal fees, their own and mine. There was no financial cap in the clause. Worse for them. The termination happened within hours of my documented escalation about a regulatory risk. In legal terms, that could be interpreted as retaliation against a whistleblower. Dana closed the folder. "Cole Fenwick thinks he fired a compliance manager," she said. "What he actually did was trigger a legal mechanism your company agreed to years ago." The realization settled in slowly, for the first time since the meeting. I felt something different than humiliation. Control. Dana proposed the next step immediately, a formal pre-litigation notice outlining the clause, the timeline, and the potential exposure. "We don't send it to Fenwick," she added. "Why not?" "Because he's not the one who needs to panic. Instead, the letter would go directly to the law firm representing Orion's board of directors." I nodded. Later that afternoon, the notice was delivered. Cole Fenwick believed the story ended when he escorted me out of the building. In reality, something far more serious had just begun. 3 days after the letter was delivered, the first cracks began to show inside Orion Dynamics. I didn't see them directly at first. I heard about them through quiet messages from former colleagues, the kind people send when they're not sure whether they're helping you or protecting themselves. "Legal just called an emergency meeting," one text read. Another arrived an hour later. "Something big is happening upstairs." The meeting had been organized by the outside counsel representing the board of directors. No public agenda, no official announcement, just a closed-door session involving senior legal staff and 2 board members who rarely attended operational reviews. Inside that room, the documents Dana had sent were already circulating. My warning emails, the vendor contract with the flagged clause, the termination timeline, piece by piece. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Cole Fenwick had bypassed legal review repeatedly during the past year. Fast-track approvals had pushed multiple contracts through the system before compliance checks were completed. Several agreements carried risk exposure that normally would have triggered internal escalation. The vendor contract that started all of this was worse. If executed as written, it could conflict with an existing non-disclosure agreement and potentially trigger regulatory disclosure requirements under SEC rules. But the real problem, the one that shifted the tone of the entire meeting, was Clause 14C. The board's attorneys confirmed what Dana already knew. The clause was valid. It had been reviewed by prior counsel and embedded in multiple employment agreements for compliance staff. If my termination was connected to a documented regulatory warning, the company could be responsible for unlimited legal costs. That kind of liability changes the atmosphere in a boardroom very quickly. Meanwhile, Cole Fenwick appeared completely unaware of the storm building above him, according to someone in finance. He had sent an internal email that morning describing the situation as drama from a former employee resisting innovation. He framed the termination as a cultural shift. Speed over bureaucracy. Progress over caution. But while his message circulated across department inboxes, something quieter was unfolding inside the legal department. Files were being reopened, contracts reviewed again, and a formal internal compliance review had just begun. For the first time since I walked out of that glass conference room, the system I helped build was finally doing exactly what it was designed to do. If you think documenting the risks and letting the system investigate was the right move, leave a 2 in the comments, because when people speak up, even with a small signal, it shows that integrity and accountability still matter. The next phase began quietly, without drama, exactly the way most real investigations do. Dana and I sat down at a long conference table in her office and started rebuilding the timeline of everything that had happened over the past year. If Cole Fenwick believed the story was about a single disagreement over one contract, the records were about to prove otherwise. We began with the easiest material to gather my own archive. 15 years of emails sat in neatly organized folders on my system. Compliance reports, risk memos, contract revisions, and escalation notices were all there, time-stamped and traceable, one by one. We exported them and placed them into chronological order. The process was slow but methodical. Dana believed evidence should tell the story without emotion. If we presented the facts correctly, the conclusions would draw themselves. Soon the patterns started to appear. The earliest documents showed routine compliance reviews, the kind I had handled for years. But as we moved closer to the present, the tone changed. Emails where I raised concerns about vendor clauses were followed by sudden shifts in communication threads. Conversations continued without me. Dana circled several entries with a yellow marker. "Here," she said. "This is where the behavior changes." Cole Fenwick had begun removing me from email chains connected to contract negotiations. At first, it happened occasionally. Then it became standard practice. The next layer of evidence revealed something more troubling. Several contracts had been signed before legal review was completed. The approval timestamps proved it. Sales teams had received instructions to accelerate deal closures and handle compliance later. In other cases, my written warnings had simply been ignored. One memo described the exact risk hidden in the vendor contract that eventually triggered my termination. The response from management had never arrived. We didn't exaggerate anything. We didn't need to. By the time we finished mapping the documents across the table, the structure of the problem was obvious. This was no longer about one executive's decision in a meeting room. It was about a pattern of bypassing safeguards that had protected Orion Dynamics for years, and for the first time since I was fired. I felt certain of something. The evidence didn't need a dramatic argument. The truth was already dangerous enough. The pressure inside Orion Dynamics began to build slowly. The way structural stress forms in a bridge long before anyone hears the metal strain. I wasn't inside the building anymore, but the signals were reaching me through former colleagues who still were. The board had hired an independent audit firm. That decision alone told me the situation had moved beyond internal politics. When boards bring in outside auditors, it means they no longer trust their own reporting systems. The auditors started with the most obvious question: the contracts. Dana and I had already mapped a timeline showing where legal reviews had been bypassed. Now the auditors were verifying the same trail from the company's internal records. The first numbers came back quickly. 11 vendor contracts had been executed without proper legal review. 3 of those contracts contained clauses that conflicted with existing non-disclosure agreements with other partners. 2 agreements were potentially worse. If regulators examined them closely, they could trigger disclosure requirements under federal securities law in a technology company that relied heavily on investor confidence. Those words carried enormous weight. Within days, the rumors started moving through Orion's offices like electricity through a damaged circuit. Employees whispered about the audit in hallways. Department managers canceled meetings without explanation. Legal teams requested copies of agreements that had been considered closed deals only weeks earlier. Outside the building, the pressure was spreading as well. One of Orion's largest enterprise partners paused renewal negotiations on a $12 million contract. Officially, they described it as a governance review. Unofficially, people inside the company knew it meant hesitation. Soon after that, Orion's stock began to slide, not dramatically, but enough to attract attention. Meanwhile, Cole Fenwick appeared determined to behave as though nothing unusual was happening, according to someone in operations. He continued presenting aggressive expansion plans in management briefings. But something had changed. The invitations to certain meetings had stopped arriving in his calendar. Strategy sessions he normally chaired were suddenly being held without him. The investigation had not produced a conclusion yet, but the center of gravity inside the company was already beginning to shift. The message reached me late in the afternoon, delivered through the same quiet network of colleagues who had been keeping me informed since the investigation began. The board is meeting tonight. Not a scheduled quarterly meeting, not a strategy session, a closed executive session. Those are the kinds of meetings companies rarely admit are happening. No public agenda, no minutes circulated afterward, just directors, outside counsel, and a problem serious enough to demand immediate attention inside that room. The lawyers representing Orion's board presented the findings gathered during the audit. Dana later confirmed most of what had been discussed. First, they reviewed the timeline. My compliance escalation regarding the vendor contract had been documented clearly. The warning emails were time-stamped and circulated through official channels, only hours later. I had been terminated. Second, they examined Clause 14C of my employment agreement. The language was precise and difficult to misinterpret. If an employee raised a documented regulatory concern and was subsequently terminated, the company assumed full legal liability for any litigation arising from that decision. That liability included unlimited legal costs. The attorneys explained that this combination of events created serious exposure for Orion Dynamics. If regulators chose to examine the vendor contract and the termination decision together, the company could face both civil litigation and federal scrutiny. At some point during the discussion, one of the board members asked a question that, according to Dana, settled the mood in the room. Did Cole Fenwick read the employment contract before signing off on this termination? No one answered. The silence apparently lasted longer than anyone expected. Finally, the board moved to a vote. There were no dramatic speeches, no raised voices, and no public confrontation. Corporate decisions rarely look dramatic from the inside. They happen quietly, recorded in minutes that only a few people will ever read. The result was straightforward. Cole Fenwick was suspended immediately pending further review. When the vote concluded, the meeting ended without ceremony, for the first time since I walked out of Orion's glass conference room. The system had reached its own conclusion, and it had done so with the calm efficiency of cold justice. The next morning, the consequences finally became visible. I didn't witness the moment in person, but the story reached me before noon through 3 different messages from people still inside Orion. When several accounts describe the same scene the same way, you know it's accurate. Cole Fenwick arrived at headquarters a little after 8:00 a.m., just like he always did. According to one of the operations managers, he walked through the lobby carrying his tablet and speaking into his phone, already mid-conversation about some new expansion proposal. Then he reached the security gate. His badge didn't work. At first he tried again, assuming the reader had malfunctioned. Orion's badge scanners were temperamental sometimes, but when the red light flashed for the 3rd time, he stopped. That was when security stepped forward. 2 guards were already waiting beside the reception desk with a printed notice from Human Resources. The explanation was short. His access privileges had been suspended pending board review. Cole reportedly stood there staring at the paper for several seconds, as if the words required translation, while that scene unfolded in the lobby. Something else was happening outside the building. A financial technology blog published an investigative article about Orion Dynamics. The piece didn't contain dramatic accusations. Instead, it laid out a careful series of facts. A senior compliance officer had raised concerns about a vendor agreement. The warning had been ignored, and the employee had been terminated shortly afterward. It also referenced an ongoing internal audit examining several fast-tracked contracts approved over the past year. The article never mentioned my name. It didn't need to. Anyone inside Orion who had been in that glass conference room already knew exactly who the whistleblower was. Within hours, the link began circulating across industry forums and private Slack groups. Analysts started asking questions about governance practices at Orion for the first time since the investigation began. The balance of power felt like it was shifting, slowly but unmistakably. 3 months later, the storm finally settled. The investigation had moved through its quiet stages: audits, interviews, legal reviews, and several tense negotiations between attorneys. During that time, I kept my distance from Orion Dynamics. Dana handled the legal conversations while I focused on documenting the remaining details that might still be needed. Eventually, the call came. Orion's board had decided to resolve the matter. The settlement discussion itself was surprisingly calm. No dramatic arguments, no raised voices. Just lawyers outlining terms across a conference table. By that point, the facts were already established. The timeline of events, the contract clause, and the internal audit findings had left very little room for debate. The agreement included several conditions. First, Orion Dynamics would provide a financial settlement that recognized both the termination and the legal exposure created by Clause 14C. Dana described it simply as substantial, which in legal language usually means no one wants to discuss the exact number publicly. Second, the company would reimburse every legal expense connected to the dispute. That included my attorney fees and the costs associated with the investigation. Third, and perhaps most important to me, Orion's board agreed to issue a formal statement restoring my professional reputation. The document confirmed that my actions had followed proper compliance procedures and that my warnings regarding the vendor contract had been legitimate. Around the same time, Orion announced internal changes. The company introduced a revised compliance framework that required legal review for all vendor agreements above a certain threshold. New reporting channels were created so regulatory concerns could reach the board directly. One final decision followed shortly after. Cole Fenwick's employment with Orion Dynamics was officially terminated. There was no severance package and no quiet consulting arrangement waiting afterward. His departure was described in a short corporate statement. For me, the moment didn't feel triumphant. It felt calm, almost quiet, like closing a long chapter that had taken far too much energy to finish. In the end, there was no celebration after everything settled. I didn't throw a party or post a dramatic announcement. I simply updated my LinkedIn profile with a short, factual description of what had happened and the work I had done in compliance over the years. That was enough. Within days, the calls started coming in. Recruiters from firms I had admired for years reached out. Some wanted advice, others wanted to discuss leadership roles in compliance and risk management. Word travels quickly in corporate legal circles, especially when a case quietly proves how important those systems really are. Somewhere along the way, someone in the industry gave me a nickname, the architect of corporate safeguards. I didn't choose it, but I understood what it meant. Cole Fenwick believed power belonged to the person who signed the contracts. What he never realized was that real power often belongs to the person who writes the clauses everyone else forgets to read. What stayed with me after everything ended wasn't the settlement or the headlines. It was a quieter realization doing the right thing rarely feels heroic in the moment. Most of the time it feels uncomfortable, lonely, and sometimes even unfair. But systems, whether in companies or in life, only work when someone is willing to stand still and say, "This line matters. I'm curious what you would have done if you were sitting in that room." Knowing the risk and knowing the cost of speaking up, would you have signed the contract and stayed silent? Or taken the same path I did wherever you're listening from today? I'd love to know. Stories like this travel far because people pass them along. If something in this story meant something to you, consider subscribing, leaving a comment, or sharing the video. Every small action helps these conversations reach someone else who might be facing a moment where integrity feels expensive. And sometimes, one story arriving at the right time can remind someone they're not alone in choosing to do the right thing. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.